Jean, would you like to begin now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, hello everybody, and very special greetings to the speakers who have made a great introduction. And I must say that I'm particularly thankful to Satish Kumar, who has been filling my baby bottle with Gandhian thoughts many decades ago. I owe him quite a lot in my life. Well, okay, this is a session where we'll have very interesting speakers. We have Daniel Hitzig from Alliance Sud in Switzerland, who's leading a campaign. Alliance Sud is leading a campaign to hold multinational companies accountable of their social and environmental impact anywhere in the world. We'll have Professor Riccardo Petrella, who has worked for the European Commission, who has published a book on the limits to competition, and has taken many initiatives to promote common goods. More recently, he founded the Agora of the Inhabitants of the Earth. We have Rajni Bakshi, who is a scholar and a journalist in India, and she has studied in depth Mahatma Gandhi's work and is brilliant about making it clear to everybody. We'll have François Schneider, who is a doctor in industrial ecology and a degrowth researcher who teaches at the University of Barcelona in Spain. Well, I shouldn't say Spain, maybe Catalonia. We have Wallapa van Willenswaard, who lives in Thailand and has founded this Spirit in Education movement and has done quite a lot of work on agriculture and green markets. So we have all these dimensions, and then we'll have as a respondent, we have the fortune of being able to benefit from the long-standing experience of Joe Ingram, a former World Bank high official who regularly publishes top reflections in the Hill Times and Tip and iPolitics in Canada, where he grew. He lives in Italy most of the time now. Well, okay, so these are the speakers for this subject. Our subject is very important because we heard from Manfela Ramfele and Satish Kumar quite important thoughts on what makes our society violent and how to, what are the principles of a non-violent economy. But what is important is to understand how we move from the situation in which we are to the kind of world we want to create and the kind of economy we want to create. Satish was telling us about the confusion of ends and means that has been created in our minds and in practice. And in fact, yes, it is very much so, but some of the bad habits that in which we are trapped now also come from the fact that we feel, all of us in our societies, that we are on our own. We don't feel supported by others. This is one of the big mistakes that has been made during the last few decades with the economic thinking, and that is that competition was going to be the best way of producing the best goods and of making things accessible to everybody. Competition is stupid, in fact, because we live in a world which has made us all become interdependent. Just think of one thing that happened in the last few decades. I was born in a world of 2.4 billion people. We are reaching 8 billion. It took thousands of years to have the first billion people on Earth. It will take 15 years to add 1 billion to what we are now. In a world of finite resources, if we are not careful, in fact, as Manfela Ramfele was saying, there's enough to feed everybody, but if we're not careful, it's not enough. And in fact, we have become, through environment, if nothing else, all interdependent forever. We could think that we depended on nature, we depended on human relations, but we have all become interdependent from one point of the globe to another. And what we do matters. And so competition is not the way of running the world of the 21st century. We have to be together and cooperate and be in solidarity. So that is what we have to do. And now we have to build a new system, because the system that is currently functioning is failing people and is destroying nature. Think of one thing. When I started working, my first job was, I had two jobs. I was working in a multinational company, and I was teaching assistant to a professor at the university. And in the multinational company, they were beginning to do what is called today advertising. They were trying to think of needs that people didn't have, so that we could sell some devices to the whole world. The amount of money which is spent just on advertising in the world today is over $500 billion. It's more than 3 times the amount of resources that the rich countries are dedicating to official development assistance to help other countries reach better levels of human development. This is crazy. So we have to stop the violence in our societies. And one thing that we have to do is to desert competition. We have to desert competition. That's what we have to do if we want to build the future. The economies of the future should be an economy of care. We have to take care of other people, and we have to take care of nature, but that doesn't happen spontaneously. It may happen spontaneously at a micro level, but the challenge that we have ahead of us is to change scale. Satish was telling us that we have many examples of people creating the new society in different parts of the world, and that is true. There's an archipelago of initiatives, but we must turn this archipelago into a continent of care. And so we have to take action as citizens also, so that it's not just our individual initiatives which add up to each other, but we create the frame in which all these initiatives can blossom and give results. And that's what we'll go through today. As citizens, we have to put our societies on new rails, not just denounce, but build the next system. But that means also making sure that our rules, our regulations, our laws are in accordance to the new society that we want. It's difficult because the mentality is what we've been living, and not, so what we do always speak louder than what we aspire to, what we hope for, what we believe in. We end up believing and thinking as we have lived. So we do have to set new rules in society. This is why the United Nations Task Force on Social and Solidarity Economy is proposing that the General Assembly of the United Nations adopt a resolution. But we do have laws that have been established by national governments to favor the development of social and solidarity economy. All these initiatives that Satish was talking about, the many cooperatives. I mean, if you think of the cooperative movement, for example, it's not something that is that small. If you take the 300 biggest cooperatives in the world, they manage around $2,000 billion of worth. So it's something that we can grow, but for that we do need laws that help that sector to grow, not just the laws that facilitate speculation. And we also need initiatives to stop the violence. And we need, and we'll hear Danielle about that, we need also initiatives that seize the opportunities of the moment. And Riccardo is an expert at that. He's been working on common goods for many, many years. And he will tell us certain things about that. We need to take strategic steps to build a new society. We need to rethink what we want to implement, and we'll hear from our other speakers on that. In order to put us on the right track, I would like to ask Danielle Hitzig from Alliance Sud to tell us about the initiative which is being taken in Switzerland to hold multinational companies accountable for what they are doing in the entire world. Danielle, are you connected? Because I don't see you.
I see you.
Okay, I see you.
And I hear you. Do you hear me?
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Great. So Danielle, can you tell us what is that initiative that the Swiss, that some Swiss people are taking? Why did you take that initiative? And what precedent is it that you would like to set?
First, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all around. Hi, Jill. I mean, you might remember that we met in this very office together with Raj Gopal, and I was interviewing you on Jai Jagat that was unhappily interrupted, but I'm even the more happy that the movement is going on and is growing ever stronger. Indeed, Jean, this initiative has an inherent link to the Gandhian movement. I would like to start my presentation with an outtake of a new documentary film that is part of the campaign, of the Yes campaign. On November 29th, Swiss voters will cast their ballot yes or no to the so-called Responsible Business Initiative. The person you will see in that snippet, in that outtake, the man talking is a senior Swiss liberal politician. So he is rather from the bourgeois right-wing side party, but he is an absolutely fantastic, true liberal. He was a former Swiss senator and also state attorney. His name is Vic Marty, and he's co-president of the initiative. Let's look at that snippet.
Ausgebeutete Arbeitskräfte, vergiftete Umwelt, Kinderarbeit. Wenn Konzerne mit Sitz in der Schweiz darin verbandelt sind, dann sollen sie dafür haften. So will es die Konzernverantwortungsinitiative.
Auf den Baumwollfeldern in Zentralindien wird es derzeit wieder tonnenweise versprüht, mit teils fatalen Folgen. Alleine im Distrikt Yavatmal sind letztes Jahr nach der Arbeit mit Pestiziden 20 Bauern gestorben. 800 Menschen mussten mit Vergiftungen ins Spital. Auch ein Schweizer Produkt wird dafür verantwortlich gemacht. Polo nennt es sich und Hersteller ist der Basler Chemie-Multi Syngenta.
Nous ne prétendons nullement que toutes les entreprises se comportent mal. Mais force est de constater qu'il y a des scandales qui démontrent que des entreprises multinationales ayant le siège en Suisse violent les droits fondamentaux des populations locales et crée d'importants désastres au niveau de l'environnement.
As you know, the connection between the world of business, of corporate business, and human rights has always been an issue on the level of UN, but it was always a difficult subject. And of course, you know that labor rights that we are mostly talking about here, because labor rights are part of the codified human rights, whereas environment rights, they are not so codified. But still, we address both in our initiative. And as you know, the labor rights, and especially the 8 core ILO conventions, they are part of the internationally recognized body of universal rights. These labor rights, they include prohibition of child labor, prohibition of discrimination, of forced labor, equal pay for men and women, right to assemble, right to join a union. As of today, 187 countries in the world, they have signed these conventions, abide to these rights. But a recent study, the Global Rights Index of the International Trade Union Confederation, shows clearly that labor rights are worldwide very badly respected. You might remember that in 1999, the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan launched a global compact in order to create a new frame for a socially and ecologically more sustainable world of business. He then invited multinational corporations to adhere to this initiative, the Global Compact, but this was, and this is important, on a voluntary basis. And of course, those who voluntarily respect human rights, they are not the problem. The problem are the black sheep, those who really make business by exploiting laborers, by destroying the environment, by leading a violent economy, as we are discussing here, non-violent economy. So the result of Kofi Annan's initiative was quite a mixed one. Those who already were conducting their businesses well, they were joining, and the black sheep, of course, they stayed away. So the UN took another step, and a further milestone in that relation between business and human right was introduced in 2011, when the UN Human Rights Council unanimously adopted the guiding principles on business and human rights. They were drawn by Professor Ruggie, John Ruggie, and they are named after him also, the Ruggie Principles. These principles, they state that states are committed to ensure that companies and corporations under their jurisdiction, they respect human rights. And this should be achieved through a so-called smart mix. On one side, the corporations, they can still or should still voluntarily respect the human rights, but there must be also binding state regulations. This is the so-called smart mix of the guiding principles. So in November 2011, a handful of Swiss organizations, including Allianz Sud, which is the sort of lobbying organization of 6 big Swiss development organizations, launched a petition called Justice Without Borders. And this petition was urging our government and the Federal Council and our parliament to draft a law requiring companies based in Switzerland that they respect human rights not only within the country in Switzerland, but of course that their subsidiaries, their daughter companies all over the planet should also respect human rights. And here, let me open a short bracket. You must know that no other country in the whole world has so many headquarters of multinational corporations per capita as Switzerland. This is mostly due to the fact that Switzerland has, these companies pay very little corporate tax in Switzerland, which allows companies to shift their profits from all over the world to Switzerland, where they are taxed very little. And of course, this tax money, it is lacking all over the planet for countries these Swiss corporations are operating, because the money is lacking there for educational purposes, for environmental purposes, for health purposes. So this is one of the big issues our organization is dealing with in Switzerland. So we had this petition, government and parliament did not move on. So our NGO coalition, which grew and grew and grew, I tell you more about that a little later, this NGO coalition started a popular initiative. At this point, you must know that Switzerland is a direct democracy. If 100,000 citizens sign an initiative, then the parliament and the government, they are obliged to really closely look into the matter. And they can make a counter-proposal, but if the initiative is not withdrawn, the initiative is going to be voted by the whole population. For 4 years, the parliament tried to find a compromise which would have allowed us to withdraw the initiative. But the pressure of the corporate lobbies, mainly Swiss holdings and the economy Swiss, was so strong that a good compromise was turned down. And since 3 months, we know the initiative will be voted on 29th of November. So now let's see another outtake of that multinational corporations report that is accompanying our campaign. The snippet will lead us to Nigeria, where Lafarge Holcim, a large Swiss cement producer, is active.
iléeṣẹ́ ètò dé ìlú yìí atẹ́gùn tó dáa ló ń fẹ́ sí gbogbo wa àtọmọ àti bàbá àti ìyá ṣùgbọ́n ṣáàgbá tí iléeṣẹ́ yìí ti wọ̀lú yìí tó ti bẹ̀rẹ̀ sí ṣe sìmẹ́ǹtì a gbọ́dọ̀ sọ pé ìbànújẹ́ dé bá wa ni nítorí pé wọ́n ń fi àjẹ́ wá pẹ̀lú pé gbogbo atẹ́gùn burúkú ló ń fẹ́ lù wá gbogbo atẹ́gùn sìmẹ́ǹtì wọn ló ń fẹ́ lù wá. orúkọ mi ni ìyálóde Shakiratu olóògbé bíi Babalọ́lá mo jẹ́ ọmọ bíbí ìlú Ewékòró àwọn tó bí mi náà tẹ ìlú Ewékòró láti ọdún tó ti pẹ́.
kó tó di pé ó gbéṣẹ́ sìmẹ́ǹtì wá sí ibi báyìí ìgbésí ilé ayé àwọn èèyàn nígbà yẹn ó dáa ọrọ̀ ajé wọn lọ déédéé ikọ̀ ọ̀gbìn wa yọ dáadáa. orúkọ tèmi ni Ìdòwú Azeez ní tí mo jẹ́ ọmọ bíbí ìlú Ewékòró.
sìmẹ́ǹtì tí Lafarge tán ń kù sí wa lórí nínú ìlú yìí tá a bá fọ aṣọ ní ìṣẹ́jú 5 nísìn inú yàrá wa gangan sìmẹ́ǹtì wọnú lé wa bá wa ń bẹ̀ oúnjẹ tá à ń jẹ náà sìmẹ́ǹtì ni omi tá à ń mu sìmẹ́ǹtì ni
ìkọrọ̀ ajé nílùú yìí láti wá fún gbogbo àwa tá a wà ní ìlú yìí a máa ń ṣe ẹ̀ ní láti lọ sí bí ìlú kẹjọ láti fi lè lọ wá source of income tá a lè fi jẹun.
The community of Ewekoro decided to proceed against Lafarge because Lafarge has destroyed their environment, which consists of water, air, farmland, and all other parts of the environment. When we started the case, the judge before whom the matter was a female judge. We saw that she was interested in doing justice to the case. So, and Lafarge saw that, and one way or the other, they made some moves, and the judge was transferred to another division. And the new judge appeared to be in a hurry to conclude the case. But the judge showed that he had further interest or ulterior interest in the case. Because at the end, our case was dismissed and our conclusion, was right, that the judge was compromised.
Let me tell a bit more about how exactly the initiative should work. Companies, if the initiative is adopted, companies with their headquarters in Switzerland will be legally obliged to incorporate respect for human rights and the environment in all their business activities. This so-called mandatory due diligence will be applied not only in Switzerland, but as I said, to all activities around the world. And how shall that be guaranteed, you will ask, maybe. In order to ensure that, Swiss-based firms will be liable. This is important. They will be liable for human rights abuses and environmental violations caused by companies under their control as well. So daughter companies and companies they control. So this provision will also enable victims of human rights violations and environmental damage to seek compensation in Switzerland. But, and this is important, a company will be exempted from that liability if they can prove that they have carried out their due diligence obligations. So the initiative, therefore, has a preventive effect. And of course, this is very important as it provides companies with an actual incentive to comply with their obligation. So Jean asked me in the beginning in how far the initiative is able to create a precedent. I must say we are not dreaming. It will be very hard to win that referendum. And the state of human rights and the environment in the world will not improve the day after we win or we lose the referendum. But what is very important, that day the corporate world is looking at Switzerland. The referendum is not only important for introducing that due diligence on a mandatory basis, it is also of very high symbolical value. Switzerland, in a sort, is a role model to the world. It has a functioning democracy. Wealth is more or less equally distributed in our country. But Switzerland is also a tax haven. It is also attracting illicit financial flows. So the civil society in Switzerland is about to bring up these really important questions to the table. Switzerland is harming the rest of the world with its policies. And this initiative is a first step to make people conscious that there is something wrong with the Swiss business model. if you ask me now, what do you think, like 2 months ahead, can the referendum be won? I must say this is a very difficult question to answer. Chances are good. The momentum is our side. We had just 5 votations last weekend, and they all went into the progressive direction. So there is a tendency that younger voters, female voters, urban voters are fed up with traditional conservative Swiss system. So we will see. We have not only to win the popular majority, but in a referendum, you have also to win the majority of the 25 cantons, and this will be difficult. And of course, what is interesting for you out there in the world, in how far can you learn or for your own struggle that you have in your countries. Sure, that Swiss model cannot be transferred to your country, as we have this very particular system of the direct democracy and the popular initiative. But, which is important, this referendum came only about because all different actors of the Swiss civil society put their strengths and their energies together. Today, we are a coalition of some 130 organizations. It includes human rights organizations such as Amnesty International, big ecological NGOs such as Greenpeace, the World Wildlife Fund, very important development organizations, but also trade unions and all national organized churches, the Catholics, the Protestants, and evangelical churches are on our side. They all stand side by side, and we have really built up a very professional campaign, and this is absolutely new also for Switzerland.
Okay.
We can no longer pretend that it's David against Goliath, but the story is the economic lobbies, they have raised 8 million francs for the campaign. They have just to push a button and money comes in from the big companies like Nestle, Lafarge-Holcim, and Novartis and Roche. But we also have some money, but we collected it with crowdfunding, and thousands of people in the remotest villages of Switzerland have made donations. So we are confident that we can win that campaign.
Thank you, Daniel. This is a very challenging and thrilling initiative. It just tells us that in every country, we have to make sure that as citizens, we impose a number of rules that change totally the system. Now, I would like to turn to Riccardo Petrella, because the challenge becomes even bigger. Riccardo has been working on common goods and global common goods for quite some time, and he's taking some new initiatives with mobilizing a number of citizens groups in various countries. Riccardo, can we change the rules on a global scale?
Yes, I guess that we can change. Sorry for for my voice, but I have aphonia today, so I'm really sorry. But I'm really happy and proud for the honor I have to belong to this panel and participating, and I just would like to profit to send my best regards and friends regards to Rajni Bakshi for invitation. I'm really here with great pleasure. So, and if I'm here, the answer is that we can change. We cannot admit that our future is an unchangeable future.
Tell us about
we must go to the heart of the system. And I give you an example of our days in these very weeks and months. It's, I guess, a full illusion to think that a society that respects human universal rights and universal rights of nature could be implemented if our societies continue to legally recognize the right of private ownership and the monopoly on living organisms and artificial intelligence. I am referring to patents. Patents on living organisms and artificial intelligence are now about 50,000 on living organisms, 55,000 on artificial intelligence. It means that our societies have to transfer the integral power of decision, control, and sanctions on all forms of life to the big industrial, financial, commercial, private groups of the world. The state has no longer any power. Today, the political power has not only the economic power, the political power has been privatized. And the patent is one of the most fundamental bases of violence in our economy. Patentability of life means that we have accepted to offer to private groups, financial, industrial, the power of decision on life during 20 years. This is a violence, legalized violence. The big pharmas or the GAFAs, all these companies are in the right, their right to behave as they behave. We can criticize all companies, industrial, pharmaceutical, chemicals, cement, asbestos, or we can mining, we can all criticize them. But they are right, they can do because our societies allows them to do what they do. And our societies are violent. And therefore the companies are violent. The consumers are violent. Do you mean that a consumer is a peaceful guy? Who loves nature, who loves peace and things? No. So my statement, my analysis will be around these three elements. First, just the example of patent show, human rights does not exist today in our societies. They have been cancelled gradually. In the last 50 years, all progress that were realized in the 19th century and 20th centuries have been destroyed. Human rights do not exist any longer. Human rights are not the agenda of a political system. Human rights does not exist. Human rights do not exist for companies. Brabeck, the big, strong chairman of Nestlé, always in TV, in the press, always declare that the human right to water is the greatest stupidity that the human societies have invented. Who has fought against Brabeck? Swiss people? No. Swiss judges? No. Well, I was also amongst the demonstrators in Lausanne against Brabeck. We were there, well, but Swiss people didn't vote any referendum against Brabeck. So, human rights today are not the agenda of academia, scientists, and technocrats. And therefore, our society that has liquefied, destroyed human rights, they have destroyed also common goods and public goods. In particular, common goods and public goods are today amongst the greatest mystification of dominant groups. Economic forces, social forces, trade unions, universities, they are all together in this kind of a mystification. And let me develop quickly and then make a proposal. State has lost almost its prerogatives. Even the currencies, the money is a private affair. It does not belong any longer to state authority. Why this? Because the society changed and people discovered that the state were no longer the only players in the regulation of the world affairs and the regulation of societies, but increasing multinationals at the global level were the most important players, in particular financial markets. And therefore, state lost the credibility of being an efficient, useful regulator of international and interpeople relations. And with this in mind, people said, well, but the private sector must be a political player, not a hidden political player, but an explicit political player. And by the way, the Global Compact that Daniel has made reference to from ONU was a recognition of this, that ONU, just interstate, was very unviable, inefficient. They needed to embark the corporations in order that ONU could do things. This embarkment of corporations has destroyed the public capacity of ONU to do their job. Corporations are now the dominant players in the ONU. Corporations are the dominant players in wealth or organization. Corporations decide most of the priorities of the United Nations Development Program because they have money. In the Global Compact, for instance, in 2007, the United Nations, when they decided to make a plan for water right, well, they charged the 30 major concerned corporations in the world on water to prepare a world plan for water. And this was the so-called CEO mandate for water. ONU, it means United Nations, a public organization decided to ask the global corporation milieu to prepare a proposal for a global water plan. This devaluing the role of the state and the opening emphasis has been called governance. In India, I remember in '92 when I was working on competitiveness against competitiveness, the Indian industrial in the India Financial Times published a very interesting manifest in '92. This was called Governing Without Government. And governance is governing without government. The famous governance of stakeholders. where states are considered stakeholders, that parliaments are considered stakeholders, has been the assassination of a political system theoretically able to deal with the respect of universal rights.
So what is your
And
proposal?
I come to the proposal, but this has led to also a vanishing impact of the concept of commons, the global commons. And as all of you know, in the last 20 years, the predominant culture on commons is that commons can be governed and managed by private subjects as well as by public subjects. The ownership issue does not matter in the dominant idea. And therefore, water, hospitals, education can be managed by private subjects, by corporations. And if today's the most scientifically responsible person over this mystification is Elinor Ostrom, a Nobel Prize for economics, the first woman who got a Nobel Prize in economics, but because she did a liberal theory of commons by saying that the most important thing is that those concerned by commons manage themselves as the commons. And the second that I finished on this analysis, and this is clear now under the pandemic of COVID-19, is the great mystification about the public goods. Even United Nations, even other head of states, prime minister, even Duterte at the General Assembly 3 days ago, 4 days ago, declared that vaccine must be public global goods. Duterte. Well, I'm talking about this because it's fundamental. And I try to understand where was the possibility that the Duterte type, like if Bolsonaro, like this bandit Trump could say that vaccine are public goods, would be astonishing, would be terrible. Well, the fact is that the Economic and Social Division of United Nations, since several years, has published several articles in which they claim that the public goods must be governed according to the principle of private-public partnership, and that public goods can be governed and managed by private corporations. And when now the United Nations recognize that maybe vaccine must be public goods, is because they consider that it is in the framework of the governance where stakeholders, all stakeholders are partners in the governing the public goods. This, I think, explains why human rights today have become an unachievable in the short term, an unachievable target. But we must prepare. My proposal is that many organizations organize a webinar next spring, 30 maximum, 30, 40 persons, on just the reassessment of the common and public goods as a key role in a society guided by the principle of the universal human rights and universal rights of the nature. And public and common goods, they must become the basis of a new constitutional agenda for the future of humanity and Earth life. And we must work very much, seriously, lastly, because the mystification in which we live today is terrible. Many, many thanks. Sorry to introduce a negative note, but we can do beauty, starting by very bad things.
Thank you so much. I would like at some point that we talk about how we can make a difference internationally. Also, using the United Nations, we have to make a difference between the United Nations as the body of civil servants who work there. And sometimes they are trying their best to make sure that civil society and the progressive parts of civil society get a voice and can be heard. And the decision-making power, which belongs to government in that assembly. And as you said, Riccardo, government has deserted many things. So they've handed the power to some others, so they reflect who they are. So we'll discuss these things. I would like Rajni Bakshi to give us another vision of things. To many people, Gandhi's views on the economy may seem somewhat obsolete because they are the views of the middle of the 20th century. Today, even the average Jagat activist finds it natural to use a smartphone and make use of advanced technologies to communicate as we are doing today through Zoom. Social networks have played a major role in the people's movements for democracy and freedoms and social progress. So what is the relevance of Gandhi's legacy for a non-violent economy in the 21st century?
Thank you so much, Jean. Thank you to the Jai Jagat community for including me in this really august panel. So I will try to answer your query by sort of going way upstream to what I consider to be the source of our current problems, the malice that we are dealing with. And there I think it's very important to begin by clarifying that whether it is charkha or local economy, etc., these are methodological details for Gandhi. I think the crux of the matter actually is, it's better to quote John Maynard Keynes rather than Gandhi on what is the crux of what brings us to this juncture, where here we are in 2020, science is agreed, the global political system, at least in terms of surface agreement, has acknowledged that climate change is now, it's not even climate change now, it's called climate chaos, is a existential crisis, and yet we are not able to do what is required to stop it. And I think the source of it we can understand as a problem that lies at the very heart of modernity. And modernity is a West European project initially, now it's global, and now every country, every culture has given it its own shape. But the essence of it, I think, is this quotation from Keynes, who writes in 1930, in the most depressing phase or rather most despairing phase of the Great Depression. He says that for another 100 years, we must pretend to ourselves, and I quote, "We must pretend to ourselves and to everyone that fair is foul and foul is fair, for foul is useful and fair is not. Avarice and usury and precaution must be our gods for a little longer still." And I think if we want to invoke Gandhi into this discussion at all, it's imperative to acknowledge that this assumption, which, and by the way, Keynes is not saying this out of the blue. He's only building upon what 200 years of knowledge, of thinkers and various other historical developments have been based on. We don't have time to go into that history of what made up this mindset. And this is what Gandhi is essentially opposed to. Even freeing India from the British crown is a relatively smaller goal. This is the crux of the matter. And therefore, to me, unless we are able to grapple with this underlying cause, we cannot have a non-violent economics. And yes, dealing with the black sheep, having stricter regulation of corporations, making systems work so that all stakeholders' interests are accounted for, worrying about how wealth can be distributed more evenly. These are all important and significant goals. But they are all of these goals and all of the many micro creative initiatives that are, being put forward to achieve these goals are not going anywhere very much. We must recognize that. We must, look at the last 40 years really with brutal honesty. So I'll give you two examples of two very large, really civilization. One is a civilization changing trend, which gave us so much hope, and that is the creation of the World Wide Web. Right? Now, I often play this as a little game in many public speaking engagements, and I promise you I do this in a wider assortment of forums, and I ask for a show of hands for how many people know who Tim Berners-Lee is. I promise you, even in the most well-informed gatherings, barely a hand or two goes up. And that's because Tim Berners-Lee is not a billionaire. He has not become a power monger because of what he did. And what he did is that he gifted us the World Wide Web. And he didn't patent it. That is what made it the World Wide Web. And today, and for many years over the last 30 years, Tim Berners-Lee is frequently lamenting how the World Wide Web is being cannibalized by its own children, notably Google, Facebook, etc. And the irony of that is not missed by me, because we are being heard just now on Facebook. So what Berners-Lee has been lamenting is that the democratizing and decentralizing potential of the World Wide Web has been swallowed up by its own creations. And today, the internet through the World Wide Web has become the basis for the most sharp and stark concentration of money power, and now also manipulative power. A lot of it we already knew, but this recently released film, The Social Dilemma, you can watch it on Netflix. It is literally from the horse's mouth. The people who have worked on these systems in Silicon Valley are telling you in very, very frightening detail how the human mind in societies across the world, how the human mind is being manipulated and democracy is being undermined. So there goes the biggest promise that we had from technology at the turn of the century. It has been neutralized. Then the other development that was giving great hope 20 years ago was the rise of socially responsible investing. And yes, today, I think last I looked, it was over $21 trillion that are circulating through some kind of socially responsible investing filters. But how does it matter? Because the day on the Earth Overshoot Day is still moving up every year. This year, it was on 22nd of August. When this measure first started around 2000, Earth Overshoot Day used to come in October. So, and to make matters worse, John Elkington, who created the term triple bottom line, about 2 years ago, he wrote an article in Harvard Business Review withdrawing. He said, this is the first time that maybe that a concept has been recalled. But he said, I recall the concept now. I pull it back, because he's saying that that's not what triple bottom line was meant to be, namely what it has become, which is just a kind of an accounting trick. And all of this is happening because why this foul is fair culture continues to thrive is because we are not able to de-link the definition of value, what is value and how it is stored, we are not able to de-link it from money. And as long as that remains the case, it will be cheaper and more lucrative to cut down standing forests than to earn an income from the standing forest. That is the reason why, as things stand at the moment, and I really believe that I am not being over pessimistic, as things stand today, we don't have a chance with climate change. Even if we are able to do some mitigation, we will be lucky. But we are not even moderately on the course to halting it, even at a scale where maybe by 2050, we will be moving towards some kind of stabilization. And all of this is because we are not able, the whole global system is now so tightly hardwired in favor of foul is fair that we are not able to move it. We are not able to say that let profit take a holiday, or let profit be defined so that it is the cleaning of the oceans that makes somebody a millionaire. That is, that not the money from cleaning of the ocean, but that we ascribe a value to that cleaner ocean in a way that earns people reputational credit, exchangeable credit, many things. So it's not all hopeless. I'll give you just two areas of hope that I feel that a forum like this and the kinds of wonderful people who the Jai Jagat community mobilizes can tangibly do something about. One is that we need a massive, passionate global campaign to abolish the concept of GDP. I really believe that the time for reform is over. That happened 40 years ago when the World Bank realized that GDP was not telling us the full story, so they gave us the Human Development Index. Well, as long as these two things are separate measures, we're not going anywhere. We're not even going in the direction of a solution. Forget, reaching it. And so unless the gross domestic product concept is absolutely abolished and replaced by a measure that gives you a three-dimensional reading on a year-by-year basis of the material state of a society, of its environmental state, and its social well-being state. It must be a combined measure. The few signs of, so of course there are many people have experimented with this. We have Bhutan, if at all that seems like a viable example to people, and it's really worth looking at. They have done some very detailed work on the gross national happiness, and it's no longer just an idea, an airy-fairy idea. A lot of substantial measurable work has gone into that. And of course, there is the genuine progress indicators and other forms of green accounting that we can build upon. And lastly, there are really out on the edge kind of initiatives. One of them is called Holochain. It's not yet very well known outside the kind of tech geek circles, but that is one platform. And I'm sure there are many others. It's just the one that I'm familiar with a little bit, where they are really grappling with what are the innovative systems for a regenerative economy that is based on non-monetary measures and stores of value. And I say all this because, with all due respect, I am convinced that merely growing the micro initiatives, merely multiplying the numbers and the intensity of the grassroots creativity will not get us there. I cannot overemphasize this enough. And I say this as someone who for 40 years has been part of those communities. I have documented so many of them. I have been a supporter. I have considered myself a member of some of these communities. And all that work must continue. This is not to in any way minimize the importance of all those wonderful people who are following their dream. They must continue to do so. But since this is a discussion about what are the macro challenges, yes, I really cannot overemphasize that if we are expecting that small examples of solidarity economy will get us in any coherent shape as a species to the end of this century. I'm quite convinced they won't.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and sorry to be pessimistic.
Thank you so much. What we have to think about is how to make sure that these new indicators are used. We do not interfere enough with the use of the wrong expressions, the wrong communications. We hear a lot about growth all the time, but we don't say, what are you talking about? And so we should say a bit more about that. We should keep bashing GDP, which we don't do enough publicly. Interestingly, yes, Rajni?
John, sorry, because I'm just seeing Francois, so a mistake that I made, I wanted also to mention that the degrowth community is now a repository of some of the most intensive collection of ideas from micro to middle to macro. That is really worth looking at, because over 12, 13 years, they have accumulated a great deal of knowledge, both degrowth and the real world economics network. These are both, two important spaces in the search for alternatives that I'm sorry I left out.
Yes, when Mahbub Haq at UNDP proposed the Human Development Index, he said that he wanted something that was as gross, as vulgar, he said, as the GDP, but which shifted the attention from where GDP focuses minds to people and how they fare and their well-being. Some initiatives have been taken at more local level by a regional government in France. I'm thinking there are two which have done that, to consult people on what counts for them. So now, as you mentioned, degrowth, I'd like to ask Francois Schneider to tell us, is degrowth a proposal or is it an imperative? And also, I'd like to ask you a specific question. Many mainstream economists insist on the fact that the successes obtained in reducing the proportion and the absolute number of people living in extreme poverty during the last 2 centuries and specifically during the last 3 decades, despite the demographic growth, the number of people is diminishing, is due to economic growth, and that is to say the growth of GDP, and that the remaining bottlenecks to the GDP growth explain why there is likely to remain a core of 500 million poor people trapped into extreme poverty conditions. So is there some truth in that, or can this violence of so many people trapped in extreme poverty be addressed differently? What are the macro changes that are needed? Francois.
Thank you so much for the invitation, for these questions. First, I want to say that we don't have, in my opinion, we don't have a choice, and we need to actually go into this idea of degrowth. But I want to explain a little bit more. But it's not an idea that comes from nowhere. It has been been inspired a lot by many thinkers on Gandhi is one of them, for example. And we have been working very much the last 20 years, but all our heart in this movement that became, I think 20 years ago, a bit less than 20 years ago, it became the idea of degrowth as a political idea to promote what is I can use this presentation We have done lots of things. We have done many conferences, many publications. I don't know if you want to show the next slides. Many publications, many books on. I don't know how many articles there have been, like maybe 300 scientific articles, or we've reviewed that went to review many books, many summer schools, conferences. The next years it will be in Manchester and The Hague. I started with the one in Paris and Barcelona, and I've been involved, like inspired by Gandhi suddenly in a walk during 1 year to promote degrowth in France. So this is about the fact that there have been also lots of activism, many actions about degrowth. On the conferences, this one, the one what is shown was in the Brussels Parliament. And there's also arts developing. And anyway, it's like a mix of many actions, and I'm involved in this little project. There are many practice also of degrowth that are going on. The idea is like to manage to develop low-tech systems, like innovations to do less. There's lots of research and innovations to be done also in this direction, not just for growth. And I think now I think the growth became it's like some emerging idea that actually competes well with other emerging ideas, like that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting what's going on with this, really. And I think it's an important concept for a non-violent economy, and I like very much this concept of non-violent economy. I think we need to have more link with the idea of degrowth. I think on the idea that it's, yeah, I think if we talk of non-violent economy, we have to be clear that we have to challenge GDP, but not only that, actually the capacity to exploit natural resources need actually to reduce. You know, it's not just about new indicators. We really have to understand that there's a growth ideology that needs to be challenged. So what is degrowth? Like it's a movement that explores really another direction for society, where ecology and social justice, along with more meaningful life, become possible. We have, I can develop, I don't know if I have a lot of time, but I can talk of different sources, important sources of degrowth. Yeah, and I mean, what is very important is that a lot of the violence comes from the political context. It's not something that, well, certainly there is some violence in humans per se, but a lot of it comes from the situation. Yeah, as long as societies are organized to make to exploit so much on that resources as finite, there's necessarily room for a lot of violence, and so we have to deal with this. And really the idea is that we need the growth is really a project so that we can answer to everybody's needs, and that's everybody's fundamental needs. It has three aspects really that have been, three ways of understanding the growth. First is it's like a missile word. It's like something that has managed to bring out really other arguments to really put down growth. So it's like a stone in the lake to really change our way of thinking. So that's the first thing. Then it's also the description of new direction. We need a deep transformation of society, and it's like the description of this process of transformation. So it's a process also. It's a process of transformation. For example, people talk of degrowth of aviation, degrowth of it's less of some parts on less planes on cars, on more bicycles, for example. So it's like transformation. And it's also not only a transformation, it's also a kind of utopia. A kind of utopia that has to become a no-utopia. Lots of people live it, a new vision for to experience a new reality. So it's a web of solutions that guide our path. And it's something that is always being debated, what it is. It's not like some kind of okay, we know the truth and we all just have to be there. It's something that needs a lot of dialogue, especially because we talk about fundamental, very important needs of people, and so it needs continuously dialogue to create new stories, because it touches to emotions and so on. I mean, it needs it's about creating a world that enables cooperation, but to do so we need cooperation. We also need some sometimes some conflicts, because we are now in a world that destroys all these resources, that destroy people and so on. Okay. I want to say that it's a lot about going preventively at the source of problems. So maybe I go quickly that through the different sources, like it's about the importance of relatedness. If you can pass quickly that relation between people is more important than market relations. It's about making it's possible actually to answer needs of all on material level if we share better, if we don't destroy so much resources. And it's about the concept of entropy. It's about living. It's possible to work without linking to high material inputs, but be in coherence, and so it's about coherence at many levels, and this doesn't involve material. It's about the relation to nature, which is different, and ecology is a very important idea. Democracy is a very important idea, especially with technology. Technology is always going on with technological fixes, and there is no debate on progress, and justice is also a very, very important source of the growth. All this. And here we come with one of the questions: is that we cannot solve poverty with more growth, with more capacity to exploit natural resources and to gain natural resources, because where the earth is finite. When some people live in luxury in a rich place, this affects some poor people so it cannot be dealt with trickle down philosophy that the richer some people will get, the more little pieces of bread they can give to the poor. This doesn't work. It's all transformation that goes combining many aspects with innovation on the simplicity, opposition to some technology, developing the growth system, narratives to go upstream, but also action at the institutional level. But I don't know if I have some time to give one concrete example with what happens now with the pandemic right now, because I think we have. I think we really need to go at the sources of problems. On that, I think we have to take many examples. And I think right now what happens with the COVID pandemic is really interesting, because this is a virus that thrives on hypermobility, and especially with planes, on people traveling by car all the time, and also in some way that people that live very much inside in badly ventilated spaces with air conditioning. It's also linked to destruction of ecosystems. We don't know exactly all the sources, all the causes, but it's clear that right now it's developed. What we see is that the solution is developed by technical solutions with vaccination, or by controlling people, or by keeping people in homes, instead of or by controlling people with mobile phones. Instead of dealing with the sources of our problems, like the degrowth way of dealing with it, for me would be to really challenge the frenetic traveling, live more outside, more closer to nature, not so much in artificial environments. And then we could deal very well with this pandemic with the modern medicine. Like,
okay, so I do have a question, and then we have to move to the next speaker. But you presented what is degrowth as you see it. But how do we move from having some people agree and wanting to change something in their lives, to making it a grand scale type of initiative? How do we get there? What are the macro changes that can or should take place in the short term in order to transit towards what you're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Well, we need to have initiatives at every level. That's definitely very important. People working on innovation at the local level. We have like tons of proposals, like a work sharing on so on, that exist on so on. But more than that, I mean, other speakers are talking also of many proposals, like dealing with the commons and so on. But more than that, we need to. I think what is blocking us is that we don't have the narrative of growth is still the one people believe in, and we need to work together and have lots of dialogue to actually improve our story of our path of transformation and so on. I think we have to work on what's degrowth narratives, on imagining that actually changes are possible outside the growth ideology, and that there are many other paths that exist, and this is very important to. So we did a summer school on this, and I think it was incredibly inspiring to actually think about stories of change on this, to open our mind to other possibilities that we don't believe in, because we still don't believe in. And also we have to deal a lot with the needs, the question of needs. I think which is key for the nonviolence. I think fundamental needs, answering the fundamental needs of everybody, are key for a nonviolent economy. On this, the question of needs need to involve also dialogue between people on to see how we can answer our needs different ways, on understanding why outside the material, the material paradigm, there is also many ways to answer all the needs of people. We don't, we cannot get recognition also without a big car or traveling all over the world and so on. It needs a lot of.
We have to move to the next speaker, but I would like to invite everybody to think about the measures for a transition. While we talk about different lifestyles, we have the president of the French Republic who says about 5G, which is the big threat to 5G all over the world. He says, we don't want to go back to the oil lamp and to living like the Amish. So how do we create desire for something different? It's something that we have to think about. But now I would like to give the floor to Wallapa. You've heard all these challenges and you've been working on all this for a long time. Specifically, food together with access to clean water is the number one good that human beings need to survive. What is wrong with what is produced, how it is produced, how it is distributed and used, and what are the priority macro changes that must be made to move towards a nonviolent economy in that field?
Yeah, thank you, Sean, and thank you, Jill, and hi everyone for the opportunity to say something here. In fact, I should belong to the panel 2, the second panel, is not this one, because I'm more on the people who on the ground at the conceptual level is not my strong point. But anyhow, since in fact, Rajni, I met you in Bhutan at the God's National Happiness in Thimphu. I still remember 10 years ago. Nice to meet you. Yes. I think that I would like to refer in 4 phenomena in the 1970s. François talked about degrowth, but as you know, all know that the Club of Rome had limit to growth in 1970. And in that year, we also have E.F. Schumacher, who wrote the groundbreaking books on Small is Beautiful, that in the 70s. And the third one is that the young king of Bhutan, the third king, in 1972, only 17 years old, he responded to the consultant from World Bank that for Bhutan, the gross national happiness is more important than gross domestic product. And that statement become a historical one. And the last one that involved in our work is that IFOAM, International Federation of Organic Agriculture Movement, have met in Versailles, France in 1970 as well. So these 4 phenomena have been weaving and quite a historical thing that is happened in that decade. And from there, I think that I would like to share my, not in fact, just to give you some impression of what we have here. I would like to show that we are close to Indian and we have met Achinandi, and he wrote this book, as you will know, that the violence of sign, the hegemony and violence, a requiem for modernity. And Achinandi is really point out at the worldview level how the violence have been dominant. And I think that that is quite a critique on such a dominant culture of modernity. But the next one is a good news from Paul Hawkins, The Breast Unrest. As a publisher myself, we published this book 10 years ago of Paul Hawkins. And in fact, his most famous one is The Ecology of Commerce. And he's really go into before corporate social responsibility become you call dumb word. But in those days when Paul Hawkins wrote the book Ecology of Commerce, it hit at the heart of Ray Anderson. You know, Ray Anderson is one of the pioneers in the CSR. And he had been impressed so much by the work of Paul Hawkins, that book. Yes, as Chong said, that I would like, in this slide, I have tea movement that I'm involved with other colleagues, with my peers. The first movement is at national level in Thailand. I'm quite for the opportunity that we work with 50 projects on food movement in Thailand throughout the country. The 50 projects is supported by Thai Health Promotion Fund. And this is how I start becoming the food activist. The second movement that we just start, still young, we work with Heidelberg, the Green Party in Bonn, Germany. We have some support to do regional project of connecting the commons. And that I really learned a lot from Riccardo about the common ground, the common good. Yeah. So this is, we are in the at regional, we work with 6 countries that show here. And the third one that in fact start some years ago is Mindful Market Asia Forum. It's outreach than 5-6 countries. So we have from Bangladesh, we have from Japan, Korea, China. So all these together in order to look into new approach to it, market. But as food activists, I think that you all know that production side is so violent. The photo here showed from the big plantation of industrial food. But here, this photo is from our work. We just have an opportunity to catch the picture where there are cocktail of a lot of paraquat glyphosate, a lot of chemical substance inputs that used in our agriculture. Every day is poison food. You can see that. And if you look into distribution and consumption, the pre-packaged lifestyle of food, the frozen food here is clearly show that it is a mind that food have been transported with a lot of energy. And I think that I don't want to go into, but the food movement that we work at the moment, we look into 2 key notions. The food citizenship is mean the citizenship notion, which is the commons. And the second one is how to build a community of food, how the relationship of the production, distribution, and consumption have been weaving, not from very distant like this. And that I think that is the most dear to our heart is the CSA, though it's a small step, the community supported agriculture, which Hans and I, my family, subscribe with farmers since 2003, 17 years ago, that we are the member of the farmer group not far from Bangkok. And we have also farm markets. This is called peer organized market. So that's, and we really look into the every penny or cents that we earn, how we do the cost analysis with farmer, with vendor, which I think that I won't go into it. But the third model is that how we have a group of, we call healthy food school. We have 50 schools in one district, and with 30 farmer family together, bring from the farmer, the local, the community farmers to the school with 40 schools. So this is kind of model. And plus we go into the hospital. I mean the 50 projects that we work with. So they have a hospital staff and the farmer working together. And every model we look into a business plan, how we really make it feasible. This is another, the model of the hospital market. Just to give some impression, how we mapping and have a kind of business model. But quickly go into the connecting the commons. As you know, the work of Germany, another one from USA. We have this book in the pipeline to work with, and we are Skype and Zoom with David Boye regularly on how we shape the network in the regions, on the connecting the commons and see the common goods. And Riccardo have talked about the ownership, and we also talk about property regime, how the public reclaim the forest and announce it as a national forest. And we think that the community forest is also, that the community also do a good job. And in many cases, we have a research work that prove that the community forest is work better than the government national park and the private. So the commons and the community lives. And the third one, the mindful market, as I mentioned, that we try to map in Asia. We have cases that we work with China inside the country with young people, that they're looking, that it doesn't looking for job anymore, but looking for create their own work and their own job. And this is the work that we work with Bhutan, also for 100% organic country. So in order to see how we need to link, that is the major thing of our work. And so I think that's, unless we discuss more. No?
Well,
yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'd like to turn to Joe Ingram, who's been patiently listening and carefully listening to all the things that have been said. Joe, you have a long-standing experience as a person who's been working in international institutions. You've been a high official in the World Bank, and you're in touch with the powers that Riccardo was mentioning, all these big corporations which run the world today. If we look at, I mean, let's think of what Rajni was saying, that however good all the initiatives, the small initiatives that are being taken, can be, can we really make a difference with that? If we take into account what is described as the social and solidarity economy, and that includes the things that Francois is doing, the things that Wallapa is doing, and so on and so forth. If you look at the countries where it's between 10 and 12% at best of what is accounted for as the GDP that we have to abolish. Now, the question becomes how do we reverse things? That is to say, go from the 10%, and the 90% is the violent economy, the 10% is an economy that tries to be nonviolent. How do we reverse things and become 90%? Sometimes my feeling is that we tend to not use the instruments that some people in institutions are creating. For example, there was talk about commitments made by governments officially. Now, one of the strongest texts that has been voted at the United Nations is Agenda 2030. These 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These are not just proposals, they are a commitment made by governments. Do we hold our own governments really accountable for the commitment that they made? Are members of parliament harassed by their voters on these issues? Are ministers really challenged on that? Do we tell our governments that we have defined a yellow line that they cannot cross? If they don't respect their word, whether we like them or we dislike them, they're out. The next time they don't get our vote. You know, all these things don't happen so well. When the Millennium Development Goals were adopted at the United Nations in the year 2000, these were goals that had to be reached by 2015, and that included living in extreme poverty. The United Nations staff organized the Millennium Campaign to make sure that civil society would put enough pressure on governments, because they know they are dealing with governments every day in the General Assembly, in the Council, in the many committees that are meeting. And you have good and bad people there. You have a bit of everything. It's society which is reflected there. Do we really take advantage of these things and make it an element of strength, or do we ignore these things? Now, Joe, what is your reaction to all the things that you've heard?
Well, you've just stolen my thunder. You basically talked about what I was going to talk about, but that's fine. Listen, first of all, let me say thank you to Jill and to Jai Jagat for inviting me. This was a wonderful session, I must say. I learned a lot listening to all of you and reading some of the publications that some of you have produced. And let me also say to Jill, it's lovely to be back in a sense in an Indian context, because part of my life, I grew up as a child for 5 years in India and went to school in both Delhi and in Mumbai, in Bombay. So I was to some extent schooled in the Gandhian philosophy, if you will, and the importance of the Mahatma and his approach to economics. Now, that said, I think the dilemma that we face, and I'm going to take issue with some of the things that have been said, because that's my role, so please don't be offended if I do. But I think the dilemma we face is can one come up, and Jean, you just in a sense referred to this, can one come up with a set of proposals that strike a middle ground between what some would consider overly ambitious ideas that have little likelihood of being endorsed by major stakeholders, and I include government, civil society, and business organizations, a middle ground, and proposals that, while more politically feasible, would in fact be no more than tinkering at the edges and inadequate to the urgency of the challenges we face. So I think that's the dilemma you have posed. And I think that that's what we need to search for, okay? We can't search for extremes on one side or extremes on the other side. We have to recognize that, as you said, Jean, we have maybe 10% of the population that is aware of these issues and is engaged in them, and 90% who don't. So that, as I said, is the dilemma. Now, what I'd like to do, if I could, is come back to some of the points that each of the speakers made, and I'll comment on some of them, and give you my reaction, not just as a former World Bank employee. I spent 4 years, and Jean knows this, at the UN as the bank's special representative to the UN and the WTO, but I also subsequently was president of a Canadian policy think tank, doing a lot of work. We did a lot of work on human rights, especially with respect to Indigenous peoples and in the natural resource sector. Now, Daniel, I think, made some very, very interesting points. And the referendum coming up, you initially said it was September 29th, and then you said November 29th. So I think it's November. It hasn't taken place yet. And I found it interesting. It's a question I will have for you as well. The answer might have been implicit, but I didn't really hear it. You're talking about a referendum which will in effect hold corporations accountable. Now, I recall in 2013 in Canada, I was called to testify before the Standing Committee in Parliament in the House of Commons on development and foreign affairs. And I was asked to testify because of the work we were doing in the North-South Institute. There was a proposal by the then Harper government just before the G7 meeting in the UK to hold Canadian corporations accountable, a bill that was Bill C-14, to hold Canadian corporations accountable for any under-the-table payments or any payments they were making to governments, okay? This is a great initiative, and it received wonderful backing. But when I testified, I made the point, well, that's fine, but unfortunately, there's no companion bill which requires those corporations to be transparent and to report on what they're doing. And this suited the Harper government beautifully, because the Harper government at the time was very much controlled by and beholden to corporate. So they passed the bill, but of course there was no obligation for transparency. And this was happening at a time when other governments in Europe and even in China and in the United States, of course, were passing legislation which required a certain degree of transparency. In the United States, we talk about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which scares everybody. And it's a good thing. Now, so my question to you really is, what is the situation in Switzerland? And we can come back and you can answer this later. But that's a terribly important issue, I think. It's not just accountability, but also requiring transparency. And implicit in what you say, of course, is this whole notion of corporate social responsibility that our system, and Riccardo referred to this as well, our systems rely very much on the concept of corporate social responsibility. Well, as you all know, within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there is a basic and fundamental principle, FPIC, which stands for free, prior, and informed consent. And it requires that, governments, in going ahead with major investment decisions, like the Nigerian, I forget who put up that film, that wonderful film on the cement plant in Nigeria. I think it was Rajni who put it up, was it? Or I can't remember.
Daniel.
Sorry?
Daniel.
Yeah. In any case, clearly that's, if you had principles of free, prior, and informed consent applied not just to indigenous peoples, but to everybody, and those principles prevailing rather than relying on corporate social responsibility, which, as we know, and as we've seen from the Boeing crashes, from the Bhopal disaster, from the oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico, you cannot rely on corporate social responsibility. There have to be other principles by which government gives the okay to go ahead with major investments. So that is something it seems to me we should be pushing for. And this is something I was pushing for in Canada. Unfortunately, it was in 2013 during the time of the Harper government, and they didn't want anything to do with these sorts of principles. So I think that's an important aspect, the alternative to corporate social responsibility. Now, Riccardo, I thought, as a fellow economist, I thought his presentation was very interesting, and I agree with him entirely. I think that the role of the state versus the private sector, we've really had a situation today where the private sector is dominating public policy, and the influence of certain people in the economics profession. And I think you mentioned the Nobel Prize winner, I'll mention one as well, and that's James Mcgill Buchanan, who, as you know, won the Nobel Prize for his work on the theory of public choices. And he was propagating a lie, and he subsequently more or less admitted it, namely that as economists, the economics profession needs to convince the public that the private sector is in a better position to provide public goods than the private sector. The private sector is in a better position to provide public goods than the public sector, and that it can do so more efficiently and more cost effectively. Well, that is just nonsense, and we've learned that that's nonsense, but that is the kind of thinking that prevails, especially in conservative parties, the Republican Party in the United States, and subsequent people like Milton Friedman, and of course the Trump administration today is a paragon of that thinking. And in Canada, where the Conservative Party in Canada is very much wedded to those kinds of principles as well. And of course, on the political side, you had political philosophers and sociologists like Leo Strauss, who was advocating much the same thing. I mean, except he of course was talking about reason versus revelation, as he called it, and the importance of morality, of normative approaches to the economics profession. Incidentally, there was a wonderful book which many of you may know of called La Technique, which was written by a French theologian and sociologist back in 1954. The Technological Society, it was translated into English, and that's the title, who in a sense was saying very much the same thing as Strauss, but he wasn't advocating a lie, which Strauss was taking a very strong normative position, but it was a very conservative position, and very much aligned with the thinking in economics of James Mcgill Buchanan. So the economics profession has a lot to account for, and is a major part of the problem. And I'll come to the other issue of GDP in a moment. Now, the other point I think that Riccardo made, and I share for the most part, is that human rights don't exist in our societies. But I think we have to distinguish between first and second generation rights, between individual rights and collective rights. And obviously, in the United States, in Canada, in Western societies, there's a real preoccupation with first generation rights, namely political and civil rights. That is paramount and very much at the forefront of the discussion of human rights. Collective rights, cultural, economic, and social rights, they don't want to, they don't talk about these things, and they don't recognize them as being of the same priority as the first generation political and civil rights. So there is I wouldn't say that they don't exist anymore. I think there's a distortion in the way they're used and in the way they're emphasized. And that needs to be corrected. Now, with respect to Rajni, I thought very interesting this whole question of the GDP. And in 2012, I was invited by the Chinese government as president of the North-South Institute to make a presentation, the title of which was the critical need, global growth and the critical need for a new growth paradigm. And this was made at the China Economics and at CERD, the China Economic, I forget what it stands for, but in Haiku in Hainan. And there were people from the Central Committee there. There were maybe 800 people. And I talked about the need for us to de-emphasize GDP. That GDP was a outmoded concept, and even what's his name? The economist who originated the whole concept of GDP, Simon Kuznets. He talked about. In 1934, he appeared before Congress and he talked about the importance of GDP and the need for an income-based metric to measure economic progress. But everybody forgets, and the politicians forget, and the economics profession forgets, that in 1964, Kuznets, in an interview that he gave on, I think on television, he talked about goals for more growth, the fact that goals for more growth need to specify growth of what and more growth for what. Okay, so this was Simon Kuznets himself saying this in a public interview in the United States in 1964. And I think we need to resurrect the concerns within the economics community and amongst the international institutions which use GDP as the metric, as the prime metric for measuring economic progress. Now, there are this whole concept of GPI. You mentioned it, Rajni, genuine progress indicators. I spoke about those in Beijing in Haiku in 2012. And there are a number of states in the United States, Minnesota, the state of Maryland, who are using those broader indicators. The city of Edmonton in Canada, those broader indicators. And so the indicators are more than just income-based metrics to measure economic progress. They could measure, for example, units of energy consumption and waste. They could measure the percentage of median income needed for one's basic needs. They could measure income growth of the poor versus the wealthy. They could measure the tuition costs as a percentage of someone's annual income. They could measure median annual rent versus median income of renters. I mean, there are a number of these benchmarks which GPI could include, and we could get governments. What we need to do is get governments and international institutions like the World Bank to start giving prominence to these kinds of indicators, as well as to the income-based metric, which they will never abandon. I hate to say to Francois, but they will never abandon using GDP as an indicator, an income-based indicator. And to some extent, you need to, and I'll come to that in a moment. Anyway, I think it's important that these kinds of benchmarks, as Rajni was saying, they would need to be publicly released, like GDP is. When we turn on the news, be it Fox or CNN or CNBC or Bloomberg, they talk about GDP and growth in income, and of course the stock market. But these other indicators, they need to be given the prominence. They need to be discussed and debated in the media and with government, versus what, the delusional refrain that we hear today from most of the media on how well the stock market is doing, and therefore by implication how well all of society and the rest of the planet is doing. That is an obscene distortion of what constitutes economic and social progress on the planet. And unless we do this, and only then will our political practices or parties and governments adopt policies that reinforce rather than fracture social cohesion. I mean, there's this wonderful saying in the human rights community that peace is not just the absence of war, it's the presence of social justice. And that is something which we need to give much more prominence to. And on this point, let me just close from with a quote from the governor of Maryland, the previous governor of Maryland, Martin O'Malley, who commented, he was commenting on the need for a broader measure of progress. And he said, a strong economy, a clean environment, and a healthy citizenry go hand in hand. None can be a true measure of consensus without supporting the other two. The genuine progress indicator will help us ensure that our economic growth will not come at the cost of our natural resources, and that they will support our progress toward a sustainable future and a better quality of life. Now, with that, let me come to what Francois had to say, because I think this was very interesting, this whole concept of degrowth. There is an old Russian proverb which somebody told me. And that proverb says, that which fails to grow begins to rot. Now, I don't know, and that's a simplistic view of things, but there may be some truth to that with respect to the economy and society. I like what Francois is proposing. These are really important aspirational goals, and they're critically important. But where I disagree is I think that societies and economies need to grow. There needs to be growth, and I'll explain why. As Jean mentioned initially, population on the planet is growing very, very rapidly. We're at 7.8 million today. We'll be at 10 billion. 7.8 billion will be at 10 billion in probably 15 years. And the issue really then, it seems to me, is the quality of growth versus the quantity of growth. And I hark back to what Simon Kuznets had to say. But I do agree that we need something which reflects a broad-based sense of well-being and happiness. Wallapa, I've looked and read the book on gross national happiness. In fact, I talked about it in my final year in the World Bank, trying to convince people at the bank that this was a very important concept. That was back in 2006. I think what we need to do is prioritize the challenges we face. I recently wrote a piece which was published in a Canadian paper, in which I talked about the inexorable trends and the fact that governments generally are not recognizing and not confronting the fact that we're faced with certain inexorable trends. And they are, I don't use the term climate change, I use the term global warming. That's the trend, that's what climates will always change. It's global warming that we're at war with, okay, at this point. Another one is the demographic transition. These are trends which we can't stop, but we can manage them and control them and ensure that the impact, the results are positive on humanity and positive on the planet. The third is, and I hate to say this, globalization. We've had globalization since the first cavemen started trading with one another and families started trading with one another. And that's going to continue. The question is at what pace and how is it going to be conducted? And the fourth, of course, to which Riccardo referred, is artificial intelligence, robotization, and the impact it has on rendering obsolete jobs. So I think what we need to recognize, we need to establish a hierarchy of priorities. And global warming is right up at the top. And it's urgent. And it has to be dealt with urgently. And it can't wait for some of the other things we need to do with respect to the economics profession, with respect to I mean, whatever. It is urgent and it needs to be addressed immediately and urgently. So I think that is an important issue. And we have written about some of the things that need to happen. For example, in Canada, last year, many of you don't know this, that Canada is one of the largest per capita emitters of CO2 gas. It's, I think, third largest on the planet after Saudi Arabia and Australia. Canada, amongst the G7 countries, is also the largest provider of subsidies, direct and indirect, to the fossil fuel industry. In 2017, the amount of money that was provided in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry constituted 20% of the Canadian government budget. So these are issues which have to be addressed. Governments have to be wakened up to the fact that these are terrible distortions producing terrible outcomes. And so the issue really is, as I said earlier, how do we capture this middle ground? And as Jean had suggested, how to change public mindsets in a timely way And I say timely because we're in a position where we have to act urgently. 2050 is far too late, far too late. We saw this year the evidence of global warming with the highest temperatures ever recorded, with the highest level of CO2 in the atmosphere at 417 parts per million in 3 million years, with the drought and with fires in the Western United States, in Siberia. So we have to act urgently on these things. So how do you create the political will, especially in liberal democracies? How do you create the political will to, amongst governments and policymakers, to act quickly and to recognize that there are a hierarchy of threats, a hierarchy of needs that need to be addressed? And to come back, and I'll conclude with this, to come back to Jean's remark, it can't be done, and I hate to say this, by reinventing the wheel. We need a global framework for doing this, and that framework effectively exists, and Jean described it. It exists already, and it exists in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, okay, and the Agenda 2030. 170 governments, civil society, private sector contributed to the formulation of those goals. The institute which I led in Ottawa, the North-South Institute, we seconded one of our staff to the team that was preparing those goals for a year. So we were very much involved. They exist. The World Business Council, which is based, and Danielle would know them, they're based in Switzerland, in Geneva. They have done some very interesting work coming from the private sector, from some of the leaders of the largest corporations on the planet, which go far beyond in their proposals, far beyond what most governments are proposing to do, and indeed beyond what most NGOs are proposing to do. But nobody talks about this. It's just not known. And nobody, frankly, knows anything about the SDGs. When you watch television, the media, be it BBC or Al Jazeera, very rarely does anybody mention the Sustainable Development Goals, what they are, how they're being managed, what role they. Nobody, the general public, my sister, who's an emeritus professor in Canada, in Western Canada, didn't know what the SDGs were. None of these people really understand this. So that's a failure on the part of the UN, multinational organizations, to communicate these instruments, what they are and their importance to the global public. Anyhow, I think it's important to come back to Jean's question. We need to impel governments and the public to act on these things. We also need to elect 21st century leaders who are not lobbyists for entrenched interests. And I wrote a column earlier this year on leadership skills. Lives depend on new leadership skills for the 21st century. And those leadership skills require people who have an understanding of and a respect for science, first and foremost, especially if you're going to deal with climate change and with global pandemics. And instead, we're electing leaders who don't. It's no coincidence that the 5 countries, the countries with the 5 largest or greatest amount of cases in COVID are all led by quote unquote populist leaders. Trump, Johnson, Bolsonaro, Modi, and who's the 5th? Anyway, these are people who have no respect for science, who are all narcissists and think that they have all the right answers and that they know how to deal with these inexorable issues. Very, very dangerous. So the question is, how do we mobilize the general public to vote in liberal democracies, to vote in politicians who understand science, who respect science, and who are prepared to formulate public policies based on those kinds of understandings and not based on state capture by corporate interests, especially the fossil fuel industry. So enough said. I hope I didn't offend too many people, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Joe. Unfortunately, not only is time running short for solving the world's problems, but it's also running short for our session because we are past the time that has been allocated to us. So I would like to thank everyone for your wonderful and inspiring contributions, and I hand over the floor to Jill.
Thank you, John. Wow, this was just an amazing, amazing set of views, and all with their own authenticity coming from all of you from different places, different parts of the world. I would like to thank Jean especially for refereeing this, and ask all of you to stay with us. We're going to have a short music break, and then we're going to get into some practices of how people on the ground are carrying out nonviolent economy. So if all of you can stay tuned, I'm going to ask Jan Majay to start a musical program so all of you can take a deep breath and relax. And then we'll be ready for the next session under Anuj Jain, who will introduce at the appointed hour of 4:30 Indian Standard Time. Thank you very much.